Greetings and welcome. My name is Aaron Craig, and today's webinar is going to be doing drag and drop to GML. And we're going to be doing that with the awesome project of FireJump. So there's going to be several people in the chat moderating it. You can see some of them might be named. They might just be named GameMaker. They might have some names. So say hi. These are people from Yo-Yo that work with us, and they are awesome people. At the end of the webinar, in about 45 minutes or so, we will do a live Q&A. So if you have any questions that will come up, I'll let you know, like I'm going to stop sharing my screen and a big Q&A thing will come up and you will know that it's time to do the Q&A. So you can ask me questions about what we covered, D&D, GML, GameMaker, or just some general random questions that you want to know the answer to. So we are going to be looking at FireJump. I'll go ahead and show off the game. If somehow you haven't seen this yet, FireJump is an awesome game. It is an endless jumper where you are rescuing civilians. This one, you can choose between two different characters. As you play, this is what it looks like. You can't hear it, but it's got really great sound effects. It's a lot of fun. Put out fires as you go, and you rescue people. Now, there's a lot that's actually going on here, and it's a pretty complicated and big game. But we cover exactly how to do this both in written form and in video form. And eventually there will be some civilians that show up. At least, oh look, there's one. Okay, that gives us an idea of how the game works. That randomness is always fun to see what happens. So that's the game, and it's all done in drag and drop. And it's a really great game. Now, if you download the project, depending on what you followed along with, you may notice a small difference here and there. If you open up the objects, there is a new group. So after the video, and I think maybe after the written tutorial, but maybe someone on there can specifically answer that for me, they've added a few more polish effects. Nothing that affects gameplay too much, and we're not going to be touching on that right now. So this new folder, I'm just going to leave alone. Instead, we're going to be tackling everything that was covered in the video portion, which I actually did. So there you go. That's kind of why I'm doing the webinar in the first place, because I'm pretty familiar with this project. So that's what we're covering. Before we jump into it, I do just want to talk for just a minute about D&D. So drag and drop is primarily a beginner tool to get into coding and game making, but I do want to say that it is not just a beginner tool. You can make complete, finished, sellable games using D&D all by itself. You can have really complex code. You can make awesome games using just drag and drop. Now, that being said, when you start getting more comfortable with GameMaker, it's usually easier to jump into GML. The reason for that is you'll find more help and assistance with GameMaker language, with the actual coding, when you start looking online for questions, error help, video tutorials, written tutorials. Most of the stuff you're going to find will be in code. And so the purpose of this webinar is to get you comfortable from going from drag and drop to GML. Now, the games that you make in drag and drop, they run exactly the same. At the end of the day, all the code gets compiled the same way. The game runs, no performance issues or changes or differences between the two. But once you're comfortable with D&D, I definitely recommend switching to GML. And so that's what we're going to be doing. Now, that all said, let's go ahead and jump into it. So if you've got FireJump, you can follow along, or you can just watch, ask questions as we go, and we'll have a good time. One of the features I discovered recently with drag and drop is the ability to do a live preview. So inside of here, I'm just going to right click, come down, and we're going to see a live preview option. And this is really, really cool and quite valuable. So with this live preview option, we can actually see the GML as it would be if we converted it over from drag and drop. Now, this is a read-only preview. You can't actually do anything inside of here. So I could try to delete it, press some, do anything here, but I can't. It's read-only. And so this is just a live preview. Now we're going to go through and actually start changing the code inside of here. We're not going to do a lot of changes, but I do want to show you how to do that. But the live preview is what I'm going to use to kind of talk about the event that we're looking at and how it works, and then we'll actually change the event itself. But I just wanted to showcase the live preview. It is a fantastic tool that I was not aware of until recently. So, thought maybe you weren't either. Okay, let's go ahead and I'm going to jump over and around all of these different objects. My goal here is to introduce you to GML in what my opinion is the best and the friendliest way. So I'm going to be jumping between different objects and different events. I'm not just going to convert every single event into GML. It'd be kind of a waste of time and you might not learn anything anyway. So the goal here instead is to select events that highlight the basic syntax and the inner workings of GML versus drag and drop. So in OBJ Civilian is where we're going to start in the create event. I'm going to go to the live preview over here, and I'm going to arrange my windows so that we can actually see these side by side. So bump up the size of the text over here and move this over as much as possible. I'm not going to be able to fit everything on here, I don't think, but there's only a little bit, so that's okay. There we go. We fit everything. Cool. So this is the civilian create event. There are two code blocks inside of it. There is a choose and assign variable. Now, we're going to cover this in just a little bit, but all I want to use this for is just to show you how to convert it. So if we go over to our event, we can right click either in that or in drag and drop or in the code section itself over here, and we can convert to GML. GML stands for GameMaker language. That's what the live preview shows. Once we click this, I'm going to go ahead then and delete the live preview. It converts your drag and drop to GML. It's a straight conversion. It has comments that stay. It doesn't leave the name of the code block like the live preview does, so that is gone. But everything else is exactly the same, and it works exactly the same. Now, something to note here is if we go in and add another event, such as the destroy event, it is still in D&D or drag and drop. Now, if you're converting an actual project to GML, well, you might still have more work to do. You probably do. So this isn't super helpful. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And if you want to make all future events in GML, we're going to open up the game options over here, go to main, open it up with a double click. This checkbox right here is the use D&D as default script type. We're going to uncheck that and click OK. Now if we go back and we add another event, it is now in GML. So this is how we officially and permanently convert our project to GML. So now all future events will be in code, not drag and drop. That's how you do it. Not too hard. The process of converting your D&D to GML is just right click, convert. Most of the events are going to come out looking really well. This one here, since it had comments and everything, this is all perfectly legible. This is exactly how I would write it if I was doing code. And so there's really no difference at all, which is really fantastic. The conversion tool is awesome. But you really can't go back. So if you're in GML and you want to move to D&D, well, you can. You can click on convert to D&D, but it just makes a code block inside of here. It gives you access to everything back D&D, but this is just the code that we had inside of a code block. Now, funny enough, this is actually how GameMaker 1.4 used to work just all the time. You would just drag a code block in, and then you'd start writing the code. But this just shows you that if you're going from GML to D&D, the conversion process, like, technically it works, but it doesn't do anything. So convert it back. Just make sure that when you're ready to convert to GML, that you are not going to want to go back for anything. So it's always a good idea to save a copy of your project, use source control if you know how, do something like that, because the process is pretty much a permanent one-way conversion. All right. So let's go ahead and dive in to actually doing this now. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to find our OBJ foam right over here. So OBJ foam is what we shoot to put out fires. It's a pretty simple object with one sprite associated with it, just goes up. And what I want to do is I want to start talking about built-in variables in here. So I'm going to live preview this. We've got in the create event, we have a set speed and a set instance alpha. And these are the two built-in variables that we have access or that we change with these code blocks. So you can see it here. When I convert this D&D to GML, it's going to come out just like this, except these comments will be gone because these are the names of the code blocks. So I'm going to right click, convert to GML, say OK, and here we go. Now, these are what's called built-in instance variables. So let's talk about this. One of the awesome things about GameMaker, and even in the D&D, it does do it, but in coding, in the GML, it is all color coordinated. And the colors here are fantastic. I've gotten used to them. I think they make a lot of sense. There are preferences, and you can go and change it. When you're starting out, don't go and mess up preferences. It'll only make things more confusing. So in the beginning here, the default color for a built-in instance variable is green. So vSpeed controls our vertical speed of our OBJ foam right here. So we set it when it's made to be moving up 40 pixels every single frame. Now, vSpeed has to be spelled exactly like this. This vSpeed is a built-in instance variable. vSpeed with a capital S is not a built-in variable. It will not turn green. It will actually do nothing at all. This is just an instance variable, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But spelling, capitalization, spaces, these things are all very, very important. If it doesn't turn green, it is not a built-in variable. Now, built-in means that GameMaker Studio is the one who actually essentially created this variable for our object and our instance. And if it's built in, a lot of times GameMaker actually takes care of doing things with it. vSpeed will control the movement, the vertical movement of this object when we set it. And it has a lot of other properties as well. This image alpha is a built-in variable. It controls the transparency or the alpha for it. So these are built-in properties that a lot of times we can read and write to. Some of them are read-only. I don't believe any of them are write-only because that doesn't make any sense. So these are built-in variables that GameMaker has made for us. Now, instance means that every single instance of this in our game can actually have a different value. So vSpeed equals -40. Well, if we go into our room and we look, we actually have a foam layer. This will be important later, but there's a lot of layers here. Here's foam. If I drag my foam object into here, it's really hard to see because it's really small. But the first frame, at least, is there's our foam object. Now, if we wanted to change the instance variable here, I could double click, go to creation code, and I could set this vSpeed equal to -10 instead of -40. Every single instance of this object, and an instance just means one particular, I want to say the word instance because that's what it is, but one particular, I don't even know how to say it. It's an instance of an object. This one is different than this foam right here. These two are totally different instances. Now they share the same code and they're going to do the same thing, but they can do different things. This one can move slower than this one if we wanted it to. Absolutely. So all of those built-in variables, all of the instance variables are unique to every instance that we actually come across and that we create. So built-in instance variables are green. And if you start typing things out, you'll actually see them say built-in variable. It'll say constant, function, it'll say sprite, object, whatever it is, it tells you what it is, and you can just click on it to have it finish it for you. So if we were just typing speed, we'd actually see a ton of different built-in variables. And here are just some regular variables. Okay? So vspeed, image alpha, built-in variables. Just talking on that. Now, in GML, one equal sign is going to be for assignment. So if we want to set the value of vspeed equal to -40, we use one equal sign, and then we put the value right here. To end it, we use a semicolon, which is what this is right here. A semicolon is like a period to the computer. It tells it that it's the end of the line and it should start looking for the next logical line for it to run. Now, GameMaker is a very relaxed and lenient language. You don't actually have to have this semicolon. Now, I highly encourage you to keep it here and to get used to doing this. Most other programming languages are not that lenient. If you use something like C Sharp or Java and you don't use the semicolon at the end of the line, your code is not going to run. Just won't happen. So get used to using it, and I think you'll just be better off as a programmer and a coder in general. Now, we also use separate lines here for all of our coding. We could absolutely come in here and do this, and GameMaker is going to understand what we're doing. We as a human are going to have a hard time reading it, but GameMaker doesn't care. This is going to do the exact same thing as having it on separate lines. So a lot of what we do in actual writing GML is just making it legible. And a big part of that legibility is these comments right here. So we kind of glossed over them, but this is a comment. 2 slashes turns it dark green, and then GameMaker is going to completely ignore it. It will never look at this. It will never do anything with a comment. These are just for you and for me. A single line comment is 2 slashes. If you want to do more than one, you do a / and an asterisk, which is Shift and 8. And then you can have a multi-line comment. And to end it, you do an asterisk and a /. So if you want to type a lot because you've got a really complex section of code here, a multi-line comment is super helpful. If you're just doing 1 or 2 lines, 2 slashes will work great. Okay, that is the create event in our first look at changing D&D to drag and drop. I'm just going to make sure that everything here is still looking good on the webinar, and Q&A is at the end. We will see lots of things, so don't worry. All right, looks like everything's going good, so we're just going to keep on going. The 3/ thing at the top is a question. I shouldn't answer it, but I saw it. So there's only 2 slashes here, but one of the really cool things in GameMaker, and when you start using GML, is you can use a @description, and then when you save it, you'll actually put a description right here in the event, which is really handy to just look through all your events, and then you can, well, it's just right there. So that one is really useful. Comments are useful. I guess a caveat is once you start getting more advanced and you start writing your own scripts and functions, you can use JSON comments, JS to actually like put in what the arguments are for your function and stuff. Yeah, the GameMaker is technically looking at those comments and doing stuff. So saying GameMaker completely ignores a comment isn't accurate, but for the sake of beginners, comments are ignored and you use them for you and me and for when you want to make sure you know what you're doing and for other people to be able to read your code. Because if you've just got 300 lines of code without a single comment on there and you don't know what's going on and you ask for help, chances are you're not going to get much. So comments are your friends. Okay, let's go back to OBJ Civilian. And in the create event, we're going to talk about this right here. So we've got this is a instance variable. This is not a built-in variable. Instead, this is one that we created. We said rescued equals false. So the value of rescued is false, but we made this variable. We named it. We have to take care of it. And if we want GameMaker to do anything based on this variable, we have to tell GameMaker to do that. So this variable here is useful in our civilians. When we collide with them, if we go and look at our drag and drop code here, when we collide with them, If it's false, it means that we haven't rescued them. And that means that we play an audio, we increase our score, and then we set it to true. And we do all these other things to make the civilian be rescued, jump up, activate their parachute, and fly off screen. But that's all based on what we are doing with this. This is an instance variable, so it is only on this object and these instances of the object, but we have to take care of everything to do with it. Now, instance variables can be named almost anything. There are a few caveats, and there are a lot of different naming conventions that you can do when naming your variables. The important thing here is be consistent and make sense. So, rescued makes sense. That's okay. That's what it should be. But we could easily name this Blue Cow. And if we changed everything else from rescued to Blue Cow, then it would work exactly the same. But if you come back in a week or a month after taking a break and you look at Blue Cow and you see Blue Cow doing all this stuff, you're not going to know what that means. You might if you left a lot of comments, but anyone else looking at it is going to be like, why is this called Blue Cow? And the reason is you can name it whatever you want, but name it something logical and be consistent. Using underscores works great. There are also a lot of other naming conventions that you can look up, follow, or just come up with one yourself. If you follow any tutorials, they're going to have their own styling convention. Just pick one, be consistent. Your life will be much, much better for it. So, instance variable right here. Now we're going to jump over to OBJ player and we're going to go to the key press space event. Now, if we do a live preview over here, we can see that this red block, this purple block, these are what we call functions. So a lot of the blocks do correlate to the colors that also correlate to GML. Not all of them, but these ones here, these are all functions that we've got. So let's go ahead and convert this to GML. I'm going to open this up a little bit. And we're going to spend a little bit of time here because I have found that a lot of beginners get stuck on functions, both on writing them and understanding them. So, first thing here, this is a function. When you write it, it turns orange. If you start writing something and the autocomplete comes up, you're going to see that they are called functions. There you go. That's what they are. A function is a chunk of code that kind of runs behind the scenes. These ones are custom made by GameMaker. They are part of the engine. And in my experience, a lot of what makes a great engine is just the functions that they have built in to make your life easier. A lot of the functionality we can actually make ourselves. We can create our own functions, but there's some things that we also just can't do. Without this function here, we would never be able to add anything into our game after it is running. That would be bad. But GameMaker has a lot of really great functions. We're not going to cover all of them, but I am going to go talking about these ones here. So instance create layer. This is a function. You open it up with a parenthesis, and then you also have to close it with a parenthesis and a semicolon at the end. It takes arguments or parameters, and each one is separated by a comma. And if you fill them all out, then you are all good to go. If you miss one, let's say we delete one and we're totally missing one, well, it actually looks like it'll work, but it won't. But let's say let's take that comment off. Now this is going to come up with a little warning that says this function expects 4 arguments, but we only got 3. So you definitely don't want to forget that. And how do you know which arguments to put in here? Well, I'm going to press F1 while having this up, and it's going to bring up the GameMaker manual. Now, whenever I bring up the manual, I like to get on a little bit of a soapbox because the GameMaker manual is fantastic. Now, if you've done much like other coding, working with technical documentation, you've probably discovered a lot of it is trash. In my time, I have done a lot of web development, mobile development, other game engine development, looking at some of the technical documentation for websites, APIs, stuff like that, it's awful. Some of it doesn't exist, and a lot of it that does is almost unusable. So, this manual here is the bomb. Now, at the top, it gives you the name of the function. Then it gives you a down to earth, understandable explanation. Then, if there's something you need to know that's really important about using that function, it's right there. Here is the syntax. Syntax just means the way it must be written for it to work properly. Now, these XY layer ID and object, these are descriptors, but they're also placeholders. You wouldn't necessarily put layer ID exactly as this or obj exactly as this. X and Y, yeah, actually, that's used pretty often because X and Y are built-in variables. So that one, yeah, that one actually is pretty accurate. But this is the argument, this is the description. So X says where it's made at on the X coordinate. Y is where it's made at on the Y coordinate. Layer ID is the ID or name of where we put it. And object is the index of the object we make. Now, all of that might not make total sense. We're going to break it down. But what I'm saying is this right here is what you need to know how to use this function. And these arguments are very consistent across GameMaker. So the more functions you use, the more often you're going to see something like ID or object or X and Y, and it's very consistent. And once you learn how to read a couple of these functions, you'll know how to read them all. It also tells you if it returns anything and what it does. And lastly, it's got an example with a breakdown of what that example is doing. Okay, that's a lot of stuff. Really, really great. So we call the function name, we open it up with a bracket, then we have our first argument. Now, here D&D is a little funky in the sense that when you use this code block, the instance create layer, like if we go down to obj fire, we can actually see it right here. This is it right here. You actually pass in an X and Y, but it's going to be relative or not. Now, if you click relative, you must put in a coordinate here. If you take this out, it doesn't like you. It's not going to work. You have to put in a number. Now, technically, what we want to do here is create it exactly where this object is at. So we could uncheck relative and put in X. This stands for the X coordinate of wherever this is, which is what relative does. But as a beginner, that's not super intuitive. So a lot of these, I think almost all of them, are with relative check and a 0. But that is why it comes in with a +0 on the X and Y. Now, adding 0 to something doesn't do anything except make it look silly. So I'm going to take those off. And then that's where we are creating the X and Y for the foam. Then we have the layer ID. Now, if you remember back in our room, we actually have a layer called foam. That is why this is called foam, and it's in quotes. Now, these quotes are to make this a string or a word. That means it's actually converting this into the word foam. See, over here, this is an object. And if we put in just foam here without quotes, this would turn into a built-in or an instance variable. You see it turns blue, and we don't want that. We actually want the word foam, which is why it has to be in quotes, and it turns yellow. Then we need the object of what we're creating. And over here, obj foam is the object we want to make. And then we close it off and we use a semicolon. So let's go over some of the errors that you might encounter or that you will likely encounter as you are getting into GML. First one here is mistyping a string. So now we have the layer name FOA or FOA. This is not a real layer. We haven't made it over here. You could. You absolutely can name your layers whatever you want. But in this case, there is no FOA layer. So if we run this game now and I press space to create a foam, it will not work. It will actually crash immediately. So let's come in here, press space. Instance create layer, specified layer, FOA does not exist. Okay. You have to have it spelled the same. Capitalization is not necessary, but I encourage you to keep it the same. That way it's easy to locate over here and it's not confusing. Next up is changing from a object or whatever you need here to a variable. So you see how obj foam was red because it's actually referencing this object. Obj foam is a number that GameMaker has assigned this object, and if we want to create it, we have to pass in that exact ID, and the name obj foam just holds that ID. That's kind of how it works behind the scenes. But now you see it's blue, and we have this little yellow warning over here. So obj foa only referenced once. Now, in the create event, if we were there and we saw this yellow warning, you don't need to worry about it because we are still creating our variables. We're giving them values. We haven't used them anywhere else. But if you see this yellow warning somewhere that is not your create event, likely you have made a typo and it is going to crash. So we run this and I try to create a film block. It's not going to work. We'll get a different error, and those are always fun. Press space. Variable obj player, obj foa, not set before reading it. This is the most common error that you will run into, and it is most often caused by a typo. Again, if it's a capital M, it is no longer an object. It is a variable. You miss an M, it is no longer an object. It is a variable. It has to be exactly the same. Another very common one that you will run into if you do not name your objects, sprites, and assets accordingly is trying to create a sprite when you're trying to make an object. So this is one that I actually run into a lot with some students that I am working with. They don't name everything correctly, and so they type in a sprite instead of an object. Now here, you're actually not going to crash. So I'm pressing spacebar over and over. It just doesn't do anything because you can't create a sprite like this. It doesn't work. It's supposed to be an object. So as you're typing it out, if you see that it says sprite, well, you're in a wrong spot because you should be doing object. So name your objects with object or obj, name your sprites with sprite, and so on and so forth, because it's really easy to get that confused if you just name it foam or character or player or whatever. Very common error. Another one here is if you forget a comma. This is going to throw you a syntax error, specifically here because y is a built-in variable and it doesn't know what to do with like y and foam together. So a syntax error means you can't even run your game. You can't do anything with it. But if we were to do this, take out this comma, well, sometimes this might work because it thinks it's like one value. If I were to add these two together, now instead of a syntax error, we actually just get a warning that says we got 3 arguments when we're expecting 4. So this is going to cause you a problem too. If we run this, the game will compile, but it's not going to work the way you think. Actually, it's not going to compile at all here. So it doesn't have a syntax error necessarily. It has a compile time error, which means it will not compile because you need 4 arguments, not 3 right here. If you forget to close a parenthesis or you forget to open one, you'll have a syntax error and it will not work. So make sure you open it. You have commas in between each of them and you close it. Now down here, I think I pointed this out, but this is your function name. Here are all of the arguments right down at the bottom. For every function you go through, it will tell you exactly what it needs. If at any time you're not sure, you press F1, it opens up the manual, and it explains it for you right there. Okay, let me just check in with everyone. Looks like the chat's being handled pretty well. Awesome. Okay, then I'll go ahead and keep on going. We're actually getting pretty close to the Q&A session. So if you've got any questions, make sure you save them and we'll get to it shortly. Next up, we're going to go to the civilian. We're going to go back to the civilian create event. So over here is something really important, and that is the functions that actually return a value. So this one here, this choose function, it will select one of these things inside of here, and then it will return that value. So if we open this up, we can actually see that it returns. Now, not every function returns, and not every function that returns needs to be caught. And what I mean by caught is saved in a variable somewhere. So this one, though, is one of the ones that has to be. You can absolutely call choose by itself. It will do nothing, at least nothing that you can tell. It will return a value, one of these ones, but if you don't save it in a variable somewhere, it doesn't do anything because it's just some code that ran, took up some CPU power, and you get nothing for it. So, functions that return values, make sure you put a variable on the left, say equal, and then catch that return. Now, instance create layer returns some data, but you don't have to use it. Now, it's useful if you need to touch or do something with that specific instance, but something like choose, it doesn't do anything except return data. So if you don't return it, you don't catch it. You can catch it in built-in, you can catch it in uh, not, instance variables, ones that you've made, or you can actually use it inside of another function if you wanted to. I'll show you an example of that later. But for the most part, you gotta know if you just call this and you don't catch it, nothing's gonna happen. Okay. This part is important to know there. Now, we're going to go to the OBJ player again, and we're going to go to the left key. So we're going to go on a live preview here before we actually convert it. And we're going to talk about the if statement. So we used these all over the place in FireJump, and you've probably used them in your drag and drop or GML experience as well. The if statement is a way of changing the flow of your code based on a condition. So in this case, this is if there's gravity, and if there is gravity, then we are allowed to move. That's the only time we can move. So this was kind of added in so that you can only move, you can't move while you're on a ledge. This is an extra thing added, but this is a good example of just an if statement right here. So I'm going to right click, convert this to GML, and I'm going to check this message because I don't want to have to keep clicking OK. Now, here's your if statement. Let's break it down. You got the keyword if. Then you have an open parenthesis, a statement, and closing parenthesis. Now, it is not necessary to have these parentheses. You can just have it like this. I find this more difficult to read. I definitely encourage you to keep these in here because you can actually change the if statement, like the statement inside of here, by adding more. So we could say and then we can add another condition in here. Gravity is less than 5 or something like this. This one doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense, but I don't want to get too complex. What I want to show you is that you can have multiple sets of brackets in here. And so I just encourage you to leave the brackets when doing an if statement. So we've got the parentheses. Then we have what I call a curly brace, which is your shift and the character right next to P. You have an open one and a closed one. Now, GameMaker highlights where it opens and closes. So they turn blue like this. This is the first one. This is the second one. Then, if this is true, all the code in here will get run. If it is not true, it completely ignores it. So this will alter your flow of code because without using if statements, GameMaker will just run line by line until it finishes everything and then jump to the next object and continue. The if statement changes that. It will not run this unless this is true. Now, the if statement, you can compare anything you want. This one says gravity is greater than 0, but we could say gravity is less than 0. We could say gravity is equal to 0. Now, the trick to remember checking equality is the word to. When you say equal to something, it's like the number 2. And in GameMaker and in most languages, when you compare two things, you use two equal signs. So, is gravity equal to 0? That's how you can remember that. You can also check if something is not equal to it. I'm not going to cover that too much. You can also check to see if something is greater than or equal to it, or less than or equal to it. But for now, I'm just going to put this back to 0 or greater than. I sure hope it was greater than originally. I said so many different kinds of operators, I'm forgetting now. If the game breaks, I guess I'll know why. But this is how you can check all of these different things with an if statement here. Now, there are different ways to format it. You can bring this up here. It doesn't really matter. Again, computers really don't care about how things look. It's all for legibility for us. This is how I write them. I would encourage you to do that. You don't have to have this tabbed in either. But again, it's just easier to read. So be consistent, be legible, and you should be good to go. The other thing to note here is this right here. Target X plus equals negative move speed. I have found that the plus equals is a little confusing when you're starting out, and in the drag and drop, it doesn't really show this. So in GML, let's break this down. This line, line 7, is a shortcut. This is the long way of doing it. Target X equals negative move speed plus target X. So this right here, this plus equals, is just saying add the left and the right side together and then set the left side equal to whatever that value is. The really nice thing is you can say minus equals, divided by equals, or multiplied by equals. So the plus equals is just a shortcut. That's all it is. So long versions here, I'll comment that out. I won't actually delete it. If you don't understand this one, use the long version. All we're doing is just updating target X based on target X and the move speed variable here. That's all. Okay. Now we're going to go back to OBJ Player. Actually, we're already in OBJ Player. So we're going to go to the create event of OBJ Player. And this is a long one here. So I'm going to right click live preview here. And I just want to show you this. We're going to go through this because even though it's long, it's actually got most of the things we've already talked about. There's just two things in here that I want to point out. One of them is a benefit of using GML over D&D in that it's easier to write if statements in them, but we'll touch on that in just a second. So this is the live preview. Here's the code blocks. We're going to go ahead and we're going to convert this to GML. Now, I will go ahead and press this tab right here to full screen it. That way we can see it a little bit easier. So up at the top, we are setting v-speed and gravity. They are greens, which means they are built-in variables. Next up, we have these. Now, these are variables that we haven't seen yet. This is called a global variable. So you create it with the keyword global. You use a period, and then you give it a name and it turns purple, and you use it just like any other variable. The thing about global variables is that they can be accessed anywhere from any script, from any function, from any other object, from creation code, from room code. Doesn't matter. They are really great for things that need to be accessed by more than one object. But I'll give you a little warning that they are powerful, but they can also be altered by other things, which causes issues. So if we were to go to OBJ civilian, I could come into the create event and I could say global dot score rescue equals -5. And now every time a civilian gets created, I update the global score. And the thing is, if I needed this global score or this global value and I expected it to be a certain value at one point and I was depending on the game to run with it, uh, because I can change it anywhere, that's a little difficult to know that that's going to be the case. So, global variables are fantastic. You just need to be careful using them all over the place. The rule of thumb is stick to what we call the lowest scope necessary. Global variables have the highest scope because they can be accessed by any object anywhere. Then you've got instance variables, and then we have local variables, which we're going to touch on in just a second. So, global variables, I'll leave a comment here. We're going to scroll down. We're just assigning variables here. Then over here, we get to, in my opinion, one of the limitations of D&D, and that is writing concise if statements. So this is for choosing your second character. This is just for changing whichever character you are. But this if statement makes a lot of sense. If your global character is 0, you set all the sprites. Okay. But if it's not 0, then else, and so that means that if that's false, we go to this one, and then we go into another if statement. The thing is, in D&D, you have to do it this way because they only have if and else. They don't have the second thing, which is else if. So else if is the third or the second option, depending on how we're looking at it here, inside of an if statement. And with it, you can actually present as many options as you want to check for. So here, I could say, I'm going to copy this one over here. And I'm going to delete this if check, delete everything here. I'm going to select all this and press Shift and Tab to move it all back one. That way it's just legible. Delete that space. And now we have if character is 0, do this. Else if character is 1, do this. And then we could go on and say else if global.char is equal to 2 and 3 and 4 and 27. We could have as many characters as we want, and we just assign them using these else if statements. But D&D can't do that. So then we have the last one, which we already saw, was just an else statement. So if this one's true, do this. If this one is true, do that. And finally, if none of that is true, do this code right here. So if, else if, and else. That's how you use control statements in here, and you can change that up. D&D doesn't have the else if, but in GML, it does. Much more concise, in my opinion. Definitely what you want to be using. Okay, last thing we're going to touch on here, and then we're going to Q&A, is the OBJ player step event. So we're going to jump back to OBJ player. We're going to go to our step event, and let's go ahead and take a look at the live preview. Open this up. So the step event here is, if you didn't follow along, I'll just do a very brief explanation. In Fire Jump, the player itself really doesn't move much in the world. We actually push the world down as we jump. And that's what this step event is taking care of. So this first if statement is checking to see if we are less than the room height divided by 2. So once we've reached a certain height, the firefighter stays right in the middle and the room itself gets pushed down. So if we're there, then we do another if statement. Now this one is another if statement because it's actually inside of it. It is not an else if. So you can nest, what we call nesting, if statements and control structures. So we only do this code if this one is true. And you can nest these as much as you want. It can get very confusing very quickly. And then we do lots of different things here. And that's what we're going to tackle. So I'm going to go ahead and convert this to GML. And I'll go ahead and full screen this one as well. So here's our if statement. And I just put a space between these because I think it looks nicer. Here's our if statement. We add another one. If vSpeed is less than 0, so if we're moving, then we encounter this new thing here called an instance variable, or sorry, we already talked about that. This is a local variable. Now, this is the smallest scope that we have. This you create with the keyword var, which stands for variable, and then you give it a name. And you can use it and assign it and do everything with it just like you would expect on a normal variable. But a local variable is only accessible either in the event or inside of these brackets that you created it in a if statement, in a switch, in a with, whatever. This downspeed variable can only be accessed right here. So if I were to come down here outside of it and say show message downspeed, so this show message is a function that just brings a pop-up with the value of this variable, and I run this, this is outside of the if statement, and a local variable exists in the smallest scope possible. So we run this, and our game immediately crashes because downspeed doesn't exist. It's not set before reading it. So why do we have local variables if they're so limited in scope? Well, the reason is that they disappear when you're done using them. Other variables stick around. So like target X right here, target X is always available inside of OBJ player. It's taking up space and memory. And if we want other variables or objects to access it, we can do that pretty easily. But if we're going to use something like downspeed only in one event, in one if statement, and we never need to see it again, just make it a local variable, get rid of it. It works great. So that's what this is here. Then we have a with, which is a really cool function that allows you to go inside of another object and basically act like you're calling code from it. You can have it call functions. You can access its local variables. So Y here is with obj move parent, but downspeed is this local variable. It gets a little confusing, but it's a really powerful way of accessing other objects. You can also use local variables like this, where you have a function that you're returning a value from, but if you used it inside here, so let's copy this over, it starts making the function really long and difficult to read. So you make it in a local variable instead, because you might need to do several steps with it there. That's a really useful way of doing it too. There are some functions that take half a dozen to a dozen arguments, and so making lots of local variables with those values becomes really useful. At the end, this is all touchscreen stuff, but the thing I want to mention is that you can use variables or you can use functions inside of other functions. So this one here, this min function, selects the smallest argument that you pass in, and we're passing in the values that are returned from these functions, absolute and sign. So that's kind of cool. You can pass those in functions within functions, and it can get really complex. But if you use local variables, that can also really help with the legibility of it there. So that's everything that I actually wanted to touch on in this webinar. So let's go ahead and open up the Q&A. All right. So if you've got a question, now is the time to answer, or now is the time for me to answer, for you to ask. What do you want to know? And there's going to be a lot of questions. So I'm going to go ahead and see if I can start answering. I won't be able to do them all, but I'll start at the top. So first question, can you use data from other running programs in GameMaker while the game is running? That is a very excellent question, and one that I would say is yes, but it's definitely not a beginner. So GameMaker has functionality to reach out to websites, APIs, make calls, and get data from the internet. GameMaker can also read other files. So if you had a file that was being altered by another program that you wanted to read in, yes, you could absolutely do that. Now, there might be some file limitations inside of there. You might have some read and write errors if the other program has it open or something like that. But yeah, you could absolutely pull data from another program that is altering it and do that. Now, that that other program does need to be saving it because GameMaker is a sandboxed engine, which means it can't just spread out and touch anything in your computer. It is very localized, but yes, you can do that. Next question. What's a good practice for steps? Keep it simple, only user commands. A good practice for steps. Are you talking, Sadre? Are you specifically talking about just practice for GameMaker? Is that what you mean? Just looking for some clarification on that. Step event. Okay, a good practice for the step event. So, yeah, depending on your level, your comfortability level with GameMaker and coding, keeping the step event only what's necessary in there is recommended. So if you're going to be doing key presses, use the key press events, have the code inside of those events. It's easier to debug, especially when you're actually using the debugger because it will show you the event that causes the errors or where you're at. I know some people can write an entire game inside of a step event. I think that's a little overkill. If you keep your code where it needs to be, it's a lot easier to work with overall. That's what I would recommend. Next question. Would it be possible that GameMaker slash Yo-Yo make an official certification course for GameMaker Studio 2 in the future? That is a great question and one that I will pass along. I know you'll get a certificate after attending this webinar. It's something that's pretty cool. So there's that, but I'll pass it along. That's a great discussion right there. Anthony asks, is it possible to have a sprite jump to a certain part of its sprite index in the middle of its animation? Like if a sprite is 17 images large and it's actively animating. I'm not going to read the whole thing. So, yes, you absolutely can do that. If you've got a well animated sprite with a lot of images in there, you can check which one you're on with image index. It tells you where you're at. And you can set the image index as well. So if you're at 13 and you want to jump back to 8, sure, you can do that. One of the ways of doing like combo animation attacks, you could have it all be in one sprite and it only plays to like frame 7 unless they click the right button. And then it goes all the way to frame 13 unless they click the right button, and then it goes to 20, and so on and so forth. Yeah, you can jump around in your sprite in your image index. Shane asks, how would you find something in the manual if you're not sure what you are looking for? So that is literally the most difficult thing when you're learning something technical. Like, I was trying to figure out the name of a part on a little, like on a Raspberry Pi that I had, and I don't know what it's called. And so I have to figure out how to describe it, and I have to look this up. And really, the best way to do it is just ask on a forum and describe it the best way you can. Now, I like to just browse the manual sometimes, and maybe you'll get lucky going around through it. If you can remember any part of the name of the function or what you're looking for, you can search inside of the manual. So you can just bring it up and search a word or a function. But a lot of times, if you don't know what it is you're looking for, you also don't know how to ask, and that's hard. So you just start describing. Sometimes I'll have like 6 tabs open and I'll type something and it's like, what is this piece here? Or what is this called? Or how does this work? And I read a paragraph on a page and like, oh, this might be it. So then I search. It's like, oh, that's not it. So I go back, and it's just kind of a learning game. The more you learn, the better you'll get at it. Paul says, will you host future webinars to cover other topics? There will be more webinars in the future. I don't know if I personally will be covering them. I hope to. But yes, we will be doing even more webinars in the future. Riley says, or asks, if you use with, can you move more than one object with code from just a single object? Yes, that's actually what the code was doing that I gave the example of. That obj move parent was a parent to dozens of objects in the room, and all of them were moving at the same time. So with is the correct way to do it. If we had just said obj move parent dot y plus equals down speed, what I have found is that really doesn't work. It takes it takes every single object, sets all of them to just one random y. It just selects one of them, and then it increases all of them. So using with, yeah, you can move more than one object at a time. Shane asks, is it possible to do shaders / lighting that isn't just circle or masks. So I don't have a lot of experience with the shaders and lighting, but from what I have seen, there is some really advanced stuff you can do in there. I would be surprised if it's just circle or masks, and if it is, there are ways to make it work or look like it's not just circles and masks. Daniel asks if D&D objectively inferior to GM. Oh, it probably is it objectively inferior. Will current features exclusive to GML be added to D&D in future updates? So, objectively, no. D&D is not inferior to GML. It is different. I personally don't use it because I don't use it. There's not D&D on a lot of other code that I use. I've done mobile development and app development, and there's no drag and drop solutions for those. So I use code on pretty much everything I do. But if I was really good and proficient in D&D, I could probably code just as quickly, or I could probably make games just as quickly with D&D compared to GML. I only pointed out, I think there was like one discrepancy that D&D doesn't have an if or an else if. I guess that is objectively less than GML, but I also know that GameMaker is constantly adding more updates to D&D, and it is getting better and better. So I would not be surprised if that's something that got added in, or at the very least was fixed somehow. So yeah, D&D is not inferior to GML. It's just easier to find help with GML. Scott asks about paths. How would you have an instance delete itself when it gets to the end of the path? So when you're using a path in GameMaker, there are a lot of constants or built-in data about that path. So you start a path, you start an object on a path, and you can actually tell how far along that path is. There's also a path end that will run and that you can check to see when it runs, and then you can just have that object destroy itself. So I'd have to actually go and look. I know on my channel, Let's Learn This Together, I have some very in-depth path videos, and so you can check those out if you want some help. But yes, there is absolutely a way to know when you've reached the end of a path and call functions to do something. Alfred asks, I would like to know if we will receive a recording. Yes, this webinar will be put up on YouTube. I don't believe it's going to be like something you can download, but you can download a YouTube video. So, yes. Kyle asks, which instance variables are the most popular among GML users? Is there a ranked list? Interesting. I have never heard of a ranked list, but I would not be surprised if Yo-Yo has like statistics on that. Maybe they're pointing that out right now. That's a really interesting question. Uh, but at the same time, it's one that's almost like totally trivial. Like it's just trivial because all of the built-in variables are used for different things. I would say X and Y would be the most popular because anytime you want to move something, you have to call them. After that, probably sprite index, stuff like that, where you just have to use. Do you use GM Edit? No, I don't. So I cannot recommend it because I actually don't know anything about it. I assume it's an editor for GameMaker, something I'll look into because I'm always interested in learning more. But yeah, I don't know. 2 questions. Josiah said, I wrote a book. What book is that? My book is called So You Want to Be a Game Developer. And then the subtitle is Let's Get It Done in 30 Days. And then if I was trying to make a game work on really weak hardware, what is the most important thing I should do for optimizing my game? So optimization comes at the end, but if you're making it on like for old hardware, I don't know, maybe you're emulating like a original Game Boy or an Atari or something. Texture sizes are huge. You want to make sure your texture pages are as small as possible because older systems are going to have like real limitations on those that newer systems just don't care about. And then running your code efficiently when it comes to loops, uh, coding them so that you only do the things you absolutely need to do. Because the beautiful thing about code is there's a million ways to do anything. There's not necessarily a right or wrong way, but there are more efficient ways, both in writing the code and in getting it to run. So sometimes longer code can be more efficient because you actually use less of your CPU as you are running the code. So shorter is not always better, but those are the things that I would highly recommend. Sadre asks, is there a physics engine built in? And is there one purchasable? Yes, there's a physics engine built in. You just open it up and right on the object, you can check for physics. And in your room, you can make it a physics room. And after that, you use different functions for physics, but you've got the capability of doing pretty much everything you want. You can make some really fun games very quickly with the physics engine. Rodrigo asks, do you know about the UI tool update if it's coming to GMS, as creating a UI is currently very difficult and time consuming? So I think they addressed this in the chat, but if you want to know what's coming along the pipeline for GMS, they actually have it all laid out and you can beta test some of the software to get features. I do not know anything about a UI update, but I will agree that creating a UI is time consuming and difficult. So if I hear about it, I will pass the news along. Robert asks, is it overkill that I'm reading the GML overview and reference before working with GMS2 proper? Only I would say only if you're not actually doing anything in GameMaker. So it sounds like you are someone who prepares and likes to know exactly what they're getting into before you dive in. Nothing wrong with that, but I definitely recommend playing around with it. Just start typing, make something, run your game, see what happens. It's a great idea to continue reading and learning as you go, but if all you do is read and not do, I would say that would be overkill because you're too caught up in the learning about the theory of it instead of the actual practice. Von Rick asks, is there a way to scale a portion of an image in the image editor? Scale a portion. Yes. In the image editor, if you press S for the select tool, you can select part of your sprite, Control C to copy that, and it actually becomes its own brush. And that brush you can tick up, like on the size of the brush near the top. You can increase the size or you can decrease the size, and that will scale that part of it. And then you just paint it down. It's not super great. It might not be what you're looking for, but it's the right idea behind it. Dustin asks, what is the limit of GameMaker Studio 2? Can I make super polished 2D games like Hollow Knight? Yeah. There is, as far as the limitation for 2D games, I would say there isn't any, because GameMaker can do it all. Now, the polish level is really up to you. In my experience, you can make a game in a week, in a month, and then spend 6 months polishing that. So, yes, you can make any game you want. And what I like to do for inspiration and to get pumped up is to go on the Yo-Yo website and look at the game showcase, especially the trailers they've got, because those are games and those are awesome. There are some fantastic games that have been made with GameMaker, and the only real limit is what you want to do or how much time you want to put into it. Ayushman, don't know if I'm saying that right, asks, any good GameMaker books that you know of for beginners and custom creators? Well, I actually wrote a book, which is what I'd recommend. But besides mine, you can find on my website, letslearnthistogether.com. I don't know of a lot of other books. There's some older ones, but I haven't seen anything relatively new come out. So that's one of the reasons I wrote it, is because there wasn't anything out there. For custom creators, no, I can't point to any books that are like intermediate level off the top of my head. There's a lot of courses and tutorials, but not a lot of books out there on that. So, okay, that looks like we are done with the Q&A portion of it, and I will see if I can close this up and jump over to the chat. I was having some trouble getting to the chat before, but there we go. Looks like I'm there. So we are calling it here. That's the end of the webinar from drag and drop to GameMaker language. I hope you enjoyed that. If you want to see more content from GameMaker or from me, you can check out several places. Go to Twitter. Follow Yo-Yo Games on Twitter. They will be doing more webinars like this, more content to get both beginners and the people who are in the middle of making a game to get their games made. That's part of what I'm going to be helping out with as well throughout this time. And if you want to see more content from me, you can check out my YouTube channel at Let's Learn This Together or my website, letslearnthistogether.com. It's if you just search for Let's Learn This Together, you'll find me. But this is the first of many coming up. Thank you so much for joining. And as I like to say, keep making, keep learning, and I'll talk to you later.